It's Africa's misfortune, if I may say so. We are not united. We don't see things the same way. Some are afraid, some are hesitant, some are there for the interests of other people.
Those were the first words from the youngest president in the world and perhaps the bravest. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke those words, he wasn't blaming anyone. He was confessing a truth that has haunted Africa for generations. In 2025, Burkina Faso was a nation surrounded by enemies and abandoned by friends. Terrorist attacks, Western interference, and silent embargoes had drained it to the bone. When Traoré took power, he discovered the unthinkable: a country at war with less than 100 rifles and a single supply line of ammunition. What kind of leader stands in the middle of chaos with nothing but courage in his hands and dares to fight? What kind of young man looks at the world's most powerful nations and says, "No more. We will fight with what we have and build what we need"? From that moment, a revolution began, not just of weapons, but of spirit. Traoré expelled the foreign forces, rebuilt his army from scratch, and declared a new kind of independence, one forged in sacrifice, not diplomacy. For him, sovereignty is not a slogan. It's a daily act of defiance against those who believe Africa should forever kneel. Today, the echoes of that defiance are being heard around the world, and yet a question remains: can a small, landlocked nation truly stand against the empire that feeds on its weakness? Stay with us until the end of this story, because this is not just the tale of a soldier or a president, it's the story of a continent finding its voice again. If you believe that courage can still change history, then share this story. And if you believe that truth is stronger than fear, subscribe. When Ibrahim Traoré walked into the presidential office of Burkina Faso for the first time, he didn't inherit power, he inherited emptiness. The war against terrorism had already consumed thousands of lives. Villages were abandoned, roads, silent families displaced. Yet the most shocking discovery was not the devastation, it was what he found inside the country's armory. Less than 100 functional rifles, fewer than 100,000 rounds of ammunition, and only one fragile supply route to serve an entire nation under siege. He could hardly believe it. A country of 20 million people fighting on multiple fronts had been left disarmed. Soldiers on the front lines fought with borrowed guns or sometimes none at all. They faced enemies funded and equipped by invisible hands that claimed to be their allies. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Foreign diplomats told him quite openly that they would support both sides of the war. They would help the terrorists while claiming to help Burkina Faso. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was policy. A war meant to never end, sustained by those who profited from the chaos. That was the moment Ibrahim Traoré made his choice. He expelled every foreign military base, French-American or otherwise, from Burkina Faso soil. He decided that if the war was to be fought, it would be their war, not one designed in Paris or Washington. But the challenge was monumental. With no allies, no weapons suppliers, and a military stripped bare, Traoré faced the impossible. Many powerful nations refused to sell him even basic equipment. The message was clear: Burkina Faso was not meant to win. And yet the young captain refused to surrender. He turned to those willing to sell, not caring about politics, only about survival. He began a national rearmament plan from scratch. Every coin, every ounce of gold, every ounce of courage was redirected to rebuild the Burkina Faso army. Factories that once sat silent were reopened to produce uniforms, spare parts, and soon weapons of their own. Recruitment surged, not out of desperation, but determination. Every man must have a weapon issued to him, he declared. That was our biggest challenge, and we achieved it. Within 2 years, thousands of new soldiers joined the ranks: volunteers, farmers, students, and ordinary citizens who refused to watch their homeland die. The army grew not just in numbers, but in morale. Where there were no tanks, there was faith. Where there were no planes, there was unity. This was not just about defense, it was about dignity. For the first time, Burkina Faso began to dream of a self-sufficient army trained and equipped entirely on its own soil. The young president even joined the early training sessions himself, teaching recruits side by side with their commanders. "We fight in Burkina Faso and we train in Burkina Faso," he said, a quiet rejection of the foreign military doctrines that had long poisoned African armies. In those early days, international observers mocked him. They called it naive, a boy's dream. But that so-called dream began to take shape in the desert, in secret camps where soldiers built not just their weapons, but their purpose. From those sands, a new kind of resistance was born. A country that once had fewer than 100 rifles now stood ready to manufacture its own. And for the first time in decades, the people of Burkina Faso began to believe not in miracles, but in themselves. The world watched in disbelief as Ibrahim Traoré did what no African leader had dared to do in decades. He turned his back on the great powers. The expulsion of French and American forces sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Western media called him reckless. African elites called him suicidal. But the people, the farmers, the soldiers, the mothers of Burkina Faso called him their own. From that moment, a new rhythm pulsed through the nation. Military camps that had once stood half empty now echoed with the chants of recruits. Every week, young men lined up to enlist. They came not for money, but for meaning. "We would rather die than let others fight in our place," one soldier said. That sentence alone captured the heartbeat of a country reborn. Still, Traoré knew that bravery without weapons was a death sentence. When major powers refused to sell arms, he looked elsewhere to allies who didn't lecture, only listened. Russia, Turkey, and parts of Asia quietly filled the void. Cargo planes began landing at night in Ouagadougou, delivering boxes stamped not with flags, but with hope. The equipment began to arrive. The army that once had nothing now had drones, vehicles, and modern communication systems. For the first time, Burkinabe soldiers fought with equal strength and greater conviction. But that was only the beginning. The young leader's real revolution was not in buying weapons, but in making them. "We are entering our third phase," he declared, "no longer buying, but manufacturing ourselves." Behind the scenes, engineers, scientists, and metalworkers joined the movement. Hidden workshops began producing the first prototypes of locally made rifles and ammunition. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. In dusty garages across the capital, young inventors began working under the slogan, "Made in Burkina," fought for Africa. And then came the speech that electrified the nation. Standing before his people, Traoré said something cryptic, something that felt almost prophetic. "Soon you will hear of a black albino who will appear, and you will understand." No one knew what it meant. But everyone felt it. It was more than a metaphor. It was a warning that the final phase of this war would reveal hidden faces, double agents, and new alliances. To the Burkinabe people, it became a symbol of revelation that truth once buried in shadow was about to come to light. As the months passed, the results began to show. The insurgents retreated. Villages once occupied were liberated. Across the Sahel, whispers spread that the impossible had happened. Burkina Faso, the poorest among nations, had done what others could not. It stood alone and survived. The international reaction was explosive. In Paris, politicians called for sanctions. In Washington, analysts warned of the spread of anti-Western populism. In African capitals, silence, uneasy, heavy silence. For some, Traoré's defiance was a dangerous precedent. For others, it was liberation in motion. And yet the man at the center of it all refused to gloat. "Victory," he said, "is not about defeating the enemy. It is about knowing why we fight." Those words echoed far beyond his borders. Across Africa, from Mali to Ghana, from Niger to the Congo, people began asking the same question. If Burkina Faso can stand, why can't we? The revolution had moved beyond guns and uniforms. It had become an idea, a seed planted in the heart of a continent long denied the right to dream freely. And though the world called him dangerous, Ibrahim Traoré had already become something more enduring, a reminder that freedom once awakened cannot be contained. When the guns began to quiet, another kind of war started, the war to rebuild a nation. Burkina Faso's transformation under Ibrahim Traoré was not measured only in battles won, but in lives restored. He looked beyond the front lines and saw another battlefield, the homes of widows, the classrooms without teachers, the markets without food. "You cannot lead," he once said, while women drowned fetching water. That sentence became the soul of his domestic revolution. Across the country, the government began paying months, sometimes years, of unpaid wages owed to workers, especially the Green Brigade, the women who swept the streets and kept the cities alive through the darkest days. Their tears of relief were not the tears of charity, they were tears of recognition. For the first time, someone saw them. Schools reopened with new curriculums emphasizing agriculture technology and civic pride. Farmers, long ignored, were placed at the center of national planning. The government provided seeds, irrigation tools, and local markets not through foreign loans, but through national savings. Our land is not poor, Traoré reminded his people. It has only been neglected. These were not grand speeches made for television. They were small acts of justice, quiet corrections of decades of corruption. He reformed public finance by digitizing tax systems and introducing electronic invoicing, a move that infuriated the country's old elites. For the first time, businesses could no longer hide their profits. Every transaction left a trail. Transparency became the new weapon of sovereignty, but it came at a cost. The powerful businessmen and foreign agents who had once thrived under chaos began to push back. Smear campaigns flooded the airwaves, accusing Traoré of dictatorship, nationalism, even madness. Yet, to the ordinary Burkinabe, these attacks only confirmed that he was doing something right. He wasn't trying to be popular. He was trying to be honest. And in a region where leadership often means luxury, Traoré lived modestly, eating the same food as his soldiers, walking through markets without guards, and listening to farmers with calloused hands. One evening during a live broadcast, he said something that would echo across the continent. "There is no revolution if the people remain hungry." That single line summed up the essence of his rule. The revolution was not about flags or slogans. It was about bread, dignity, and access to clean water. By 2025, Burkina Faso began showing signs of recovery. Inflation stabilized, agricultural exports rose, and more than 12,000 displaced families returned to their villages. The sight of children walking to school with new uniforms became a quiet victory more powerful than any parade. International observers who once dismissed the young president as a radical began to take notice. Analysts in Europe and America admitted grudgingly that something extraordinary was happening in this small West African nation. Burkina Faso was not just defending itself anymore. It was rewriting what national recovery looked like, with no IMF loans, no foreign bases, and no apologies. And through it all, one truth remained: the revolution that began with rifles was now being fought with reforms. The battlefield had shifted from the deserts of Sahel to the conscience of a nation. As Burkina Faso rose from its knees, the world's response revealed more than any speech ever could. In Western capitals, they called it a dangerous precedent. In the corridors of Washington, think tanks whispered that a new African nationalism was spreading too fast. And in Paris, television pundits used one word over and over again: insubordination. For the first time in decades, an African nation had defied the script written for it. No IMF loans, no French bases, no American advisors, just the will of its people and a leader who refused to kneel. To some in the West, that defiance felt like rebellion. To others, it was a long overdue awakening. American media outlets tried to frame Traoré as a populist, a young soldier playing Thomas Sankara. But beyond the headlines, many Americans, especially veterans and retired diplomats, saw something else: a man living the ideals they once believed in. A leader who spoke not of revenge, but of responsibility. Inside Africa, the reactions were mixed. Some presidents kept their distance, afraid of angering their Western partners. But from Mali to Niger, from Ghana to South Africa, ordinary citizens began waving the Burkinabe flag. To them, it symbolized something sacred: that African sovereignty was not a myth, but a movement. Even the African Union, once cautious, started to shift its tone. Behind closed doors, discussions turned to how the Burkina model could inspire future governance, local manufacturing, moral leadership, and homegrown security. What once seemed radical was now being studied seriously. Meanwhile, in the United States, quiet debates emerged among foreign policy scholars. Was the West losing Africa not because of China or Russia, but because of its own arrogance? For decades, Africa was seen as a project, not a partner, a place to stabilize, not to respect. But now a young captain had flipped the narrative. Traoré's message: "There is no state if there isn't a strong army," resonated deeply among those who understood history. America itself was born from the same principle: self-reliance and sacrifice. Yet somewhere along the way, those words had become uncomfortable when spoken by an African. By mid-2025, Burkina Faso had become a symbol of contradiction. A country once written off as poor and unstable now stood for discipline, innovation, and unity. While Western powers preached democracy, it was Traoré who practiced accountability, prosecuting corrupt officers, eating with his soldiers, and refusing privilege. It was ironic, almost poetic. The world's youngest president was teaching the oldest lesson in politics: that freedom cannot be granted, it must be earned. And though Washington and Paris may never admit it publicly, deep down policymakers understood one thing. If more African leaders start thinking like Ibrahim Traoré, the entire balance of global power will change. Because this was no longer just a Burkina Faso story. It was a reminder that history has a habit of returning, and this time it was Africa's turn to write it. In the heart of West Africa, a quiet revolution is reshaping the world's moral map. Burkina Faso, a land once dismissed as poor, unstable, and irrelevant, has become a mirror, reflecting everything the global order refuses to see. Ibrahim Traoré's message is not about war, it's about awakening. He reminds us that freedom is not a foreign gift nor a speech written by diplomats. It's something born in hardship, defended by courage, and passed down through sacrifice. And yet, as his voice grows stronger, so does the resistance. The same powers that once claimed to protect Africa are now tightening their grip through sanctions, propaganda, and financial warfare. The goal is simple: make the young leader bend or break. But Traoré's warning still echoes through the continent. If you are afraid, you hesitate. If you hesitate, you compromise. And once compromise sets in, you're done. Those words aren't just for Burkina Faso. They are for every nation, every citizen who has ever been told that independence is impossible. They are for the farmer in Niger, the nurse in Mali, the student in Kenya, and even for those in the West who are waking up to the reality that their governments no longer serve the people but the corporations behind them. Because what's happening in Africa today is not isolation, it's reflection. When one small nation stands up, it exposes the fragility of an entire system built on control. And that's why the world is watching with both fear and fascination, as Ibrahim Traoré dares to finish what Thomas Sankara began, not with slogans, but with action. So tonight, whether you're in Ouagadougou or Ohio, ask yourself, can a continent reclaim its destiny when truth itself is treated as rebellion? Can we still believe in freedom if we're too afraid to fight for it? If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a sense of justice, or simply a belief that courage still matters, then share it. Share it not as news, but as testimony. Because history is being written again not by the powerful, but by the brave. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.